I have always loved exploring the world around me. Not cities with their noise, nor tourist routes trampled by crowds, but wild places. The kind where few dare to tread, where nature remains untouched by asphalt and concrete. Mountains and forests have always called to me, beckoning with their silence and mystery. And in the United States there are plenty of such places if you know where to look. But this time it all happened spontaneously. No maps, no planned routes, no lengthy preparations. Just me, a backpack, and the mountains that always seemed eternal and unchanging. Autumn had draped the forests in a soft golden blanket, and I walked along a trail almost completely hidden under fallen leaves. Every step was accompanied by a rustle, as if the earth was speaking to me. The trees stood in their peak splendor. Bright yellows, crimson reds, and occasional greens formed a picturesque canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, playing on the tree trunks and casting intricate patterns on the ground. The air was fresh, slightly chilly, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and pine. Occasionally I encountered deer. They emerged from dense thickets, their large eyes watching me warily before disappearing back into the forest like ghosts. Their grace and lightness always mesmerized me. It seemed as though they were part of this land, its very soul. Birds added to the symphony. I heard their songs, chirps, and the flutter of wings. Life here thrived in its own rhythm, far removed from humanity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the forest was bathed in soft orange and pink hues. I chose a small clearing surrounded by tall pines to set up camp. The spot was secluded and flat enough for a tent. After unpacking my gear, I began gathering firewood. Dry branches snapped underfoot, while larger, older pieces released a faint, mossy scent into the air. When the fire roared to life, everything around was bathed in a warm, cozy glow. The flames crackled, casting strange shadows on the surrounding trees. I sat there, feeling the heat seep into my body, gazing up at the stars. The mountain sky always feels closer, the stars brighter. The silence of the night was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, the crackling of firewood, and the distant cry of some nocturnal bird. It was a perfect moment. Everything seemed frozen in time, leaving me alone with this wild, beautiful world. A soft breeze brushed against my face, and I froze. It wasn't just cold. It carried a smell that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. A heavy, nauseating stench like something rotting, something dead. That smell is unmistakable. I swallowed hard and listened. At first, nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in the wind and the crackle of the fire. But then, a sound. Barely audible, as if something was moving between the trees, trying not to reveal itself. A sound so faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been alert. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps. I held my breath and scanned my surroundings. My eyes darted over the dark tree trunks, trying to spot something out of place. But the forest remained eerily silent. I had no weapon, no knife, no gun. Slowly, very slowly, I reached for my backpack sitting nearby. One thought pounded in my head. Grab the essentials. Leave the tent. There's no time to pack. Every muscle in my body screamed with tension, and I was certain any sudden movement would draw whatever was out there. The backpack was in my hands, and I clutched it to my chest like a shield. My entire body trembled with fear as I stared toward the source of the sound. The thought crossed my mind. Maybe I could grab a burning branch from the fire and scare off whatever it was. But something deep inside stopped me. An inexplicable primal fear. Not like the usual instinct for self-preservation. This was the kind of fear that said, "Move and you die. And then I saw them. In the bushes, about 30 feet away, 2 eyes appeared. They glowed red like embers in the fire, but it wasn't reflected light. They emitted that eerie glow themselves. One thought flashed in my mind. Predator? But what kind? A bear? A wolf? No, these eyes were different, too intelligent, too malevolent. I forced myself to move slowly, reaching for a branch I had placed near the fire earlier, as if anticipating the need. The burning end was already charred, but still glowing. I gripped it tightly and, summoning the last scraps of courage, hurled it toward those eyes. The branch flew through the air, lighting up the space ahead of me, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't an animal, or at least not entirely. A creature. It stood on 4 limbs, but its body was too human. The shoulders, muscles, even the shape of its skull, it looked like a wolf, but twisted, fused with something human. Its jaws were filled with enormous teeth, and its eyes burned through me. I don't remember standing up. Fear took over, and my body moved on its own. I ran. My legs carried me, my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. The forest became a labyrinth. Shadows danced on the trees, and the sound behind me grew closer. The creature was chasing me, and I could feel its presence at my back. Its steps were fast, confident, and I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. Branches whipped at my face, snagged my clothes. I barely saw where I was going, only charging forward headlong, hoping the darkness would hide me. My mind screamed, "Run, run, or you're dead!" But my body began to falter. My breath was ragged, my legs felt like lead. I knew I was about to collapse. And then the ground disappeared beneath me. I was falling. The wind roared in my ears, cold and merciless. It was too dark to see how far I was falling, but the sensation stretched on too long. Suddenly, impact. Branches snapped and broke, slowing my descent. I hit each one on the way down before finally landing on the ground. The world spun around me, then faded. Darkness swallowed me, and I lost consciousness. I opened my eyes and was immediately struck by a dull ache coursing through my entire body. Sore muscles, raw skin, everything screamed that I had been through something terrifying. But that wasn't the most important thing. I realized I wasn't lying on the ground, surrounded by branches and rocks, but on a bed. A hard, creaky bed with springs that dug into my back. An old man was leaning over me. His face was deeply wrinkled like weathered oak, with thick eyebrows overshadowing dark, probing eyes. His gray hair stuck out in all directions, and his clothes were simple. A faded shirt with rolled-up sleeves and well-worn trousers polished smooth with age. He was looking at me with a mix of curiosity and, it seemed, caution. I struggled to sit up, every muscle in my body protesting. The room I found myself in was modest but cozy. Wooden walls darkened slightly with age enclosed the space. In one corner, a battered stove held a few drying socks. Next to it was a simple wooden table draped with a faded cloth, surrounded by cracked clay bowls. The floor was covered with an old, threadbare rug, and beside the bed was a chair with an uneven leg, draped with a pile of rags. A small window, shuttered roughly, let in only a dim grayish light. The old man's gaze was unwavering and scrutinizing, as if I were some strange animal that had wandered into his home. His weathered face carried a mixture of surprise and suspicion, as though he were trying to puzzle out who I was and where I had come from. I swallowed hard, struggling to find words. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded weaker than I'd expected. I explained that I had fallen from a cliff, hoping that would suffice. But his expression didn't change. He simply shook his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. His posture relaxed as he leaned against the back of a chair, sharply contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. I told him my name, trying to sound calm, though inside I was burning with questions. He seemed to weigh my words carefully, his eyes growing even more cautious. Then he asked if I had come from outside. The question caught me off guard, but I nodded. The answer seemed obvious, yet his tone and expression made it clear that my presence here was something significant and possibly dangerous. He straightened, saying nothing further, and walked to the door. His steps thudded dully on the wooden floor. The door creaked as he opened it, and then he left, leaving me alone. I remained sitting on the bed, trying to make sense of where I was and what this place could be. Why had he asked if I came from outside? What did that even mean? Everything in this room, from its furnishings to the man himself, felt like I had stepped into another time. Not just strange, wrong. Forcing myself to breathe steadily, I noticed my backpack propped against the wall, as if someone had carefully placed it there. Moving was painful, but my need to understand outweighed the discomfort. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and made my way toward the bag. Every step was a struggle, but I finally reached it and bent down to pick it up. The contents seemed intact. This brought some small measure of relief. After scanning the room again, I decided to step outside. The air inside felt heavy, and an unshakable sense of unease grew with every passing second. I approached the door, pushed it open, and it groaned in protest as though it hadn't been oiled in years. Stepping out, I froze. Before me was a small town, frozen in time. Narrow cobblestone streets wound between houses that looked as though they'd been pulled from an old book about 19th century life. Stone facades, shingled roofs, wooden shutters. Everything spoke of an era long gone. Some of the buildings were clearly over a century old, their walls cloaked in moss, their tiny windows seeming to hoard what little light they could. The street was alive with activity, but everything seemed surreal. People moved about their business, yet they were all dressed in outdated clothing. Men in rough, worn frock coats and hats pushed carts laden with hay, vegetables, and wooden crates. Women in long skirts and aprons carried baskets of goods or led children by the hand. The children, upon noticing me, stopped in their tracks and stared. One boy pointed at me, whispering something to his friend. The townsfolk eyed me as though I were an intruder. Their gazes were wary, curious, and in some cases even fearful. I tried to ignore their stares and slowly walked forward, taking in my surroundings. The air smelled of smoke and freshly baked bread. The street led to a central square where a large wooden cross stood, surrounded by market stalls. Vendors sold vegetables, fruit clay pots, and rough-spun cloth. As I walked through this town, I felt more and more like I wasn't just in a different place. I was in a different time. Wagons pulled by horses clattered loudly over the cobblestones. Children played with wooden dolls, and women exchanged gossip near a well. In the distance, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang out. Everything was so vivid and real that a chill ran down my spine. I tried to piece together what was happening. This town was real, but its appearance didn't match anything from the reality I knew. Everything about it told me I had stumbled into a place that wasn't on any map or in any guidebook. Walking through this strange place, I noticed more and more that the people here behaved in ways that felt off. Yes, they went about their business, pulling carts, trading goods, chatting among themselves, but everything seemed cloaked in some unseen shadow. Their faces were too serious, their eyes constantly darting about, as though searching for something lurking just out of sight. Even the children, who should have been laughing and running around, played quietly, almost furtively. No one laughed. No one spoke loudly. It felt as if a heavy weight hung over this town, pressing everyone into wary submission. The atmosphere was oppressive, like the air itself was charged with tension. I kept scanning my surroundings, hoping to find some sign of modern civilization. Power lines, streetlights, anything familiar. But there was nothing. No cars, no phones, not even basic road signs. It all looked as though I had stepped into another century. For a moment, I thought this might be some kind of Amish community secluded from the outside world. But even they, from what I knew, lived with some sense of normalcy. Here, everything felt wrong. There was something intangible yet unmistakably out of place. Lost in my thoughts, I didn't see her coming. The impact hit me from the side, sudden and forceful, knocking me off balance. I crashed to the ground, my shoulder and head slamming against the hard cobblestones. Pain shot through me, and for a moment my breath caught in my chest. My first reaction was anger. Who would do this? But when I looked up, the anger melted into fear. Standing over me was a woman. At first glance, her appearance might have seemed like something from a theater production or a masquerade, but here, in this unsettling place, it felt terrifyingly real. Her face was smeared with dirt or paint, and her hair was twisted into wild dreadlocks tied with ribbons and feathers. Her clothing was rough and dark, adorned with strange talismans made of bones, feathers, and stones. Necklaces of various sizes and materials clinked as she moved. Her eyes were wide, almost unblinking, with a crazed, animalistic seemed. She stared at me as though I were prey caught in a trap. Then, with a sudden motion, she flung her arms upward and began to scream. Her voice was piercing, feral, and every word she shouted felt like a curse. She pointed at me over and over, her finger trembling with rage, shouting in a language or dialect I couldn't understand. But the message was clear. She was accusing me. People who had been going about their business began to stop. One by one, they approached, forming a circle around us. Their faces bore a mix of fear and grim acceptance, as though they agreed with her but were also terrified by what she represented. I scrambled to my feet, trying to explain myself, to tell them I meant no harm, but my words were drowned out by her unrelenting screams. She yelled that I had brought misfortune to their settlement, that my presence was a harbinger of disaster. The crowd nodded, murmuring among themselves. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with outright hostility. I tried to plead with them to convince them that this was a mistake, but it was no use. Suddenly, the woman pulled a strange knife from the folds of her clothing. Its handle was carved from bone, etched with intricate patterns that seemed ancient and ominous. She raised it above her head, shouting what sounded like an incantation. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and froth formed at the corners of her mouth as she began advancing toward me. I stepped back instinctively, but the crowd behind me closed ranks, preventing any escape. Someone shoved me forward, closer to the woman. My back pressed against the circle of bodies, but no one let me pass. Panic surged through me, and my mind raced, grasping for a way out. The woman kept advancing, her face twisted in madness. She raised the knife higher, and I was certain this was the end. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the crowd. It was the old man who had saved me. In his hands, he held a whip, its handle worn but sturdy. Without hesitation, he cracked it against the woman. The sharp sound echoed through the square, and she screamed, a shriek of rage rather than pain. She lunged at him, but he struck her again, keeping her at bay. The woman hissed and howled like a cornered animal, her fury consuming her. But after several strikes, she abruptly turned and fled, her wild screams fading as she disappeared among the buildings. The crowd began to disperse, though their reluctance was palpable. They moved slowly, casting nervous glances at me as they went, as if I were still the source of some impending calamity. The old man approached me and helped me to my feet. His grip was firm, his expression calm yet resolute. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow. His movements carried a quiet authority, and though he seemed unshaken, there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested he understood the gravity of what had just occurred. The building we approached looked like an old, abandoned church. Its once majestic spires were weathered and crumbling, with parts of the roof caved in, exposing the skeletal beams inside. The stone walls were darkened with age, covered in moss and deep cracks, as if nature itself was reclaiming the structure. Large windows that had likely once held colorful stained glass were now hollow, their empty frames allowing the wind to whistle through. Above the entrance was a symbol, a cross, but it was damaged, distorted in a way that made it seem almost malevolent, as though someone had deliberately warped it. Inside, I expected to see rows of wooden pews, an altar, and the familiar trappings of a church. Instead, what greeted me was something entirely different. The space was filled with crude, makeshift beds, cobbled together from uneven planks. Some were covered with dirty blankets. Others had stained, threadbare mattresses. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay, mingled with an unsettling scent, ash or perhaps rot. Pale light filtered through the cracks in the walls and ceiling, casting shifting shadows that moved with the slightest breeze. The old man scanned the room as if ensuring everything was in order, then made his way to a bed along the wall. It stood apart from the others, slightly better kept, with a thicker blanket folded neatly at the head. He gestured toward it, silently indicating that it was mine now. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but my mind churned with too many questions. I asked him where I was and what was happening here. He answered calmly, as if recounting a well-worn tale. Strangers rarely stumbled into this place, he explained, and when they did, they were met with suspicion. He called the town cursed and added with unnerving finality that leaving was impossible. His words struck me like a blow. I stared at him, trying to discern whether he was serious or if this was some bizarre ritual meant to frighten outsiders. But his expression left no room for doubt. He believed every word. A chill crept down my spine. Could I truly be trapped here? Could this place, this nightmare, be real? I quickly pushed the thought aside, unwilling to accept it. The old man must be mistaken, or perhaps he was trying to scare me into submission. Determined, I told him I would leave, and I turned toward the door. He made no move to stop me, but as I stepped away, he called out, "Today is the day of the harvest. You'd best be back before nightfall." The words sounded like nonsense to me, so I ignored them and walked out. Back on the street, the oppressive atmosphere of the town was as stifling as ever. People continued to glance at me, whispering among themselves. Some hurried away as I passed, as though avoiding even the briefest interaction. The children who had pointed at me earlier now watched in silence, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. Their stares followed me as I moved through the narrow, winding streets. The farther I ventured, the quieter the town became. The cobblestone streets gave way to dirt paths, and the houses grew sparser and more decrepit. Eventually, I reached the northern edge of the settlement, where the land opened up into sprawling fields. Here, The road dissolved into packed earth, leading toward the farmland beyond. The fields stretched endlessly, divided into uneven patches by low stone walls and clusters of gnarled trees. Farmers worked the land, their movements methodical and slow. But something was off. One by one, they began to stop what they were doing. Some stood, gathering their tools, and started heading back toward the town. As I walked past, they turned to watch me, their gazes heavy with unease. In their eyes, I saw a mixture of fear and pity. It was as though they knew something I didn't, and the weight of their unspoken knowledge gnawed at me. One of the farmers, an old man with a deeply lined face and hunched shoulders, suddenly grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, and his calloused fingers bit into my skin. He spoke in a trembling voice, the words spilling out in a rush, but I was too caught up in my own thoughts to fully process them. All I caught were fragments, please. Warnings. His voice quivered with desperation as he begged me not to go any further. He said that beyond this point lay only death. I pulled free from his grasp, shaking him off. I couldn't turn back now. Whatever was happening here, I needed to understand it. And the only way to do that was to keep moving forward. The fields gradually gave way to a forest, but it wasn't like the one I had traversed before. This forest was foreboding, even under the pale light of day. The towering trees with their gnarled trunks and thick canopies seemed to block out the sun, plunging everything into an oppressive twilight. The ground was carpeted with rotting leaves, and the air was thick with the cloying scent of dampness and decay. I realized, with a cold knot in my stomach, that the forest encircled the entire town like an impenetrable barrier, a boundary dividing the human world from something far older, wilder, and infinitely more dangerous. I stepped forward cautiously, my boots sinking into the soft, decomposing earth. The deeper I ventured, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched became. At first, it was just an itch at the back of my neck, a prickling sensation that refused to be ignored. But soon I began to hear things. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the faint sound of footsteps. The noises came from all around me, closing in and then retreating like the tide. I stopped and scanned my surroundings. The forest was eerily still, yet I could swear I saw movement in the shadows. Then I saw them, silhouettes flitting between the trees, quick and elusive. Their eyes glowed in the dim light like embers, appearing here and there in the gloom. There were too many to count. My mind flashed back to the creature I'd seen the previous night, and a wave of terror crashed over me. These things were like it. No, they were the same as it. But now, instead of one, I faced a pack. I forced myself to move, my every step slow and deliberate. The creatures didn't retreat, but neither did they attack. It was as if they were toying with me, testing my limits. Low growls echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees and striking fear into my chest. My heart pounded so hard it felt as if it might give me away. The sounds grew louder, the snapping of branches and rustling of leaves merging into a cacophony. They were closing in. Suddenly, one of the creatures leaped out from the shadows. It moved with astonishing speed, and I only noticed its presence when the ground shook under the impact of its landing. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The beast was worse than I remembered. Massive and hunched, its dark, filthy fur clung to its muscled frame. Its eyes burned with a hellish light, and its maw split into a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I didn't think. I ran. The forest exploded into chaos. Heavy footsteps thundered behind me, accompanied by the snapping of branches and guttural snarls. They were chasing me. I didn't dare look back, knowing that to do so would mean losing precious seconds. My feet slipped on the slick leaves. Roots clawed at my boots, but fear drove me forward. Their breathing was hot on my neck, their growls almost deafening. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. The forest seemed endless. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. I stumbled but caught myself, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. Then I felt it. One of them was right behind me. A clawed paw swiped at my back, tearing through my shirt and grazing my skin. I screamed, the pain sharp and electric. Their snarls grew louder, their glowing eyes brighter. And then I broke through the tree line. I tumbled onto open ground, rolling to a stop in the soft, damp grass of the fields. Gasping for air, I spun around, expecting them to follow. But they didn't. The creatures stopped just at the edge of the forest. Their eyes still burned in the darkness, and they paced back and forth, growling and scratching at the earth. Yet none of them crossed the invisible line that separated the forest from the fields. It was as if the forest was their prison, a boundary they couldn't breach. I lay there, trembling and gasping for air, watching them. Their hatred was palpable, their forms flickering in the shadows like ghosts. Gradually, one by one, they receded into the darkness until nothing but silence remained. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. This place wasn't just strange. It was governed by rules I didn't understand. The creatures, the forest, the town, everything here was part of something far beyond my comprehension. Standing at the forest's edge, I tried to calm my racing heart. The terror of the chase still gripped me, but questions began to bubble to the surface. What was this place? What were those things? And why had they stopped at the forest's boundary? My mind reeled as I glanced at the horizon. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the fields. Dusk was settling in, and with it came the weight of the old man's warning. "Today is the day of the harvest." The words echoed in my head, no longer absurd but ominous. I needed to go back to the town, to find answers, to figure out a way out of this nightmare. I turned and began walking, retracing my steps across the now deserted fields. The workers were gone, their tools abandoned, and the only figures in the distance were those hurrying back toward the town. The gates loomed ahead, and I quickened my pace. By the time I reached them, the guards were already preparing to shut them. They regarded me with suspicion, but after a tense pause, they let me through. The wooden doors groaned as they closed behind me, and the heavy bar slammed into place with a finality that made my stomach turn. The streets of the town were deserted. Where there had been life earlier, now there was only silence. Windows were boarded up, and faint candlelight flickered behind the cracks. An oppressive fear hung over the place, thick and suffocating. I quickened my pace, heading toward the old church in the center of town. The growing darkness twisted the familiar streets into something alien. Houses became hulking shadows, their shapes distorted in the moonlight. My own shadow stretched and warped on the cobblestones, following me like a specter. Just as I neared the church, a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease washed over me. Before I could react, something darted out from a side alley. The blow came fast and hard, striking the side of my head. Pain exploded in my skull, and I crumpled to the ground. Dazed, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing over me, the madwoman from earlier. Her wild eyes and twisted expression burned into my mind before everything went black. I came to slowly, as if emerging from a thick, suffocating fog. My head throbbed, my mouth was dry, and my body refused to cooperate. The first thing I felt was the coarse rope digging into my wrists. I tried to move and realized I was tied to a wooden post. The boards beneath me creaked with the slightest motion, and the cool night air bit at my face. I was on the roof of some building. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. Nearby, I saw the old church, its silhouette stark against the star-filled sky. The town below was eerily quiet, not a single sound, not the faintest hint of life. Only the cold moonlight illuminated the empty streets, casting long, sharp shadows. Everything seemed to be holding its breath. Then I heard movement, a faint rustling in the distance. My heart began to race as I spotted shadows flickering at the edges of the town. I squinted, focusing on the source of the disturbance, and my stomach dropped. The tall fences that encircled the town, meant to protect it, were no longer a barrier. Silhouettes, dark and monstrous, slipped over them with ease. Their fluid, sinewy movements were disturbingly silent, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like embers. The moonlight caught one of them fully. It was enormous, hunched and grotesque, with elongated limbs covered in matted, filthy fur. Its snarling maw revealed jagged teeth glistening in the pale light, and its crimson eyes burned with a chilling intensity. The creatures moved with purpose, their massive heads lowering to the ground as they sniffed the air. They were hunting, searching, and I was certain they knew exactly who they were looking for. I began struggling against the ropes, twisting my wrists and pulling with all my strength. The knot behind me wasn't as tight as it should have been. The crazed woman must have tied it hastily, leaving just enough slack. My skin burned as I rubbed it raw against the rough fibers, but I didn't stop. I kept pulling and twisting until finally, the knot loosened. My hands slipped free, and blood rushed back into my aching fingers. I stood carefully, trying not to make a sound, and took in my surroundings. The creatures were already in the streets below, moving in packs like wolves on a hunt. Their heads darted from side to side, sniffing the air and the ground. One of them suddenly froze. Lifting its head sharply, its glowing eyes locked onto a small wooden house with boarded-up windows. It growled low and deep before lunging toward the door. My breath hitched as I watched it claw at the wood, shredding it effortlessly as though it were paper. Within moments, the door buckled under its massive weight. Terrified screams erupted from inside, a family begging for mercy. I could only stand there, frozen in horror as the creature forced its way in. The house shook with violent crashes and desperate cries, but soon the noise was swallowed by silence. The creature emerged moments later, blood dripping from its mouth and staining its fur. It stood in the street, surveying its surroundings with a guttural growl, its glowing eyes scanning for its next victim. I felt my knees weaken, and I pressed myself against the post, trying to steady my breath. The overwhelming terror threatened to paralyze me, but my mind screamed one thing: move. I scanned the roof, searching for a way down. At the far edge, I spotted an old wooden ladder leaning precariously against the building. It looked fragile, half-rotted, but I had no other choice. I crept toward it, wincing as the boards beneath my feet groaned. Reaching the ladder, I gripped it tightly and began my descent, moving as slowly and silently as I could. The ladder creaked and swayed, and I froze with every sound, my breath caught in my throat. But the creatures below didn't seem to notice. My feet touched the ground, and I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The streets were alive with shadows, twisting, moving, hunting. The creatures prowled closer, their low growls reverberating through the air. I needed to get to the church. It wasn't far, but every step felt like it could be my last. I moved through the shadows, keeping close to the walls, my footsteps as soft as I could manage. The wind rattled loose shutters and the sound made me jump. Then, behind me, I heard it. a faint crunch of gravel. I froze, my entire body tensing. Another sound, louder this time. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. One of the creatures stood in the middle of the street, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It let out a deep, guttural snarl, and I knew the time for stealth was over. The creature lunged, and I ran. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted down the narrow streets. The creature's claws scraped against the cobblestones, the sound piercing the night like nails on glass. It was fast, faster than I could have imagined. I darted around corners, leapt over debris, my lungs burning with every breath. The beast was right behind me, its hot breath on my neck, its snarls growing louder. Rounding a corner, I saw the church. It loomed ahead, a dark, crumbling monolith, but it was my only hope. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my legs. The creature roared behind me, spurring me on. Reaching the church door, I pounded on it with my fists, screaming for help. The heavy wood didn't budge. I turned, my chest heaving as the creature emerged from the shadows. Its eyes burned brighter. Its mouth twisted in a horrific snarl, revealing rows of blood-stained teeth. I slammed my fists against the door again, harder this time, desperation rising in my throat. Suddenly the door creaked open and the old man stood in the doorway, his face grim and determined. He gestured for me to enter, and I didn't hesitate. I stumbled inside and the door slammed shut behind me. A heavy thud reverberated through the wood as the creature threw itself against it, but the old man quickly slid a massive bar into place, securing it. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The silence inside the church was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. I looked around, my body trembling. For now I was safe, but the creatures weren't giving up. Their guttural growls and relentless scratching against the door reminded me that this was only a temporary reprieve. Inside the church, a strange, tense silence hung in the air. People had taken their places on the beds lined along the walls. Some knelt in prayer, whispering words I couldn't make out, their faces a mixture of terror and resignation. Others simply sat, staring blankly ahead as if they had already surrendered to their fate. But most of them were looking at me, wide-eyed and wary. Their gazes weren't just anxious, they held a flicker of fear, as though my presence itself was a threat. Many of them were armed. Some clutched pitchforks, others held crude wooden clubs, and a few gripped rusted swords or spears that looked as though they hadn't been used in decades. It was an army of the desperate, prepared to fight not for victory but for a chance to survive one more night. Behind me, the door was quickly barricaded, reinforced with old planks, iron rods, and anything else they could find. Everyone seemed to know their role, moving with grim efficiency. I sat down, trying to catch my breath. My body trembled like that of a cornered animal. My life had flashed before my eyes, and for the first time I realized just how close I'd come to death. My ears were still ringing from the adrenaline, and my thoughts were a chaotic mess. But then I spotted the old man. He stood off to the side, watching me. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed the weariness of someone who had seen this far too many times before. I forced myself to my feet and approached him, disbelief and anger swirling inside me. I needed answers. I demanded to know what was happening, why I was here, and what those creatures were. The old man glanced around, ensuring no one was listening, and then gestured for me to follow him. He led me to a corner, away from the others, and when I repeated my questions, he hesitated. His gaze darted around, as if searching for the right words to convey the weight of the truth. Finally, he began to speak. His voice was low, heavy with the burden of history. He told me the town was cursed, its people the descendants of those who had been trapped here centuries ago. The curse, he explained, made it impossible for them to leave. Occasionally, outsiders stumbled into this place, just as I had, but their fates were always the same. They either perished at the hands of the creatures or were forced to remain here forever. His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. My chest tightened with despair. Was it true? Was there really no way out? This place felt like a waking nightmare, and now it seemed I was trapped within it. I pressed him further, asking why they didn't try to escape or fight back. The old man shook his head, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. He explained that escape was impossible. Beyond the town lay only death. The creatures I had encountered were an unstoppable force. They felt no fatigue, no fear. They couldn't be fought, let alone defeated. The townsfolk had accepted this reality because it was the only way to survive. He went on, describing how the town remained relatively safe most of the year. But once every cycle, the day of the harvest arrived. On this night, the creatures emerged from their lairs to hunt. The only thing the townsfolk could do was hide and pray they wouldn't be found. He spoke of this ritual with a calm detachment, as though reciting a lesson learned long ago. His voice didn't waver, but it carried a deep bitterness and a sense of hopelessness. When he finished, I felt the floor drop out from under me. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, propping myself up on trembling hands. Despair washed over me like a wave, threatening to drown me. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one question kept surfacing. What now? What do I do? The night dragged on, stretching into what felt like an eternity. We sat in the church, everyone frozen in their places, trying desperately to fend off panic. The oppressive silence was broken only by the whispers of prayers and the soft crackling of burning candles. Time seemed to have stopped entirely. I had no idea how many hours had passed. 4, maybe 5, or even more. My eyes stung with exhaustion, but I couldn't let myself relax. Each minute of waiting felt like torture. From outside, faint screams pierced the night. They would rise, fall, and then fade into silence, as if someone was either crying out to drive away fear or calling for help that would never come. Inside the church, no one dared look each other in the eyes, as if fearing they'd see their own terror reflected back. Most people clutched their makeshift weapons, pitchforks, clubs, rusted swords, with hands so tight their knuckles turned white. The air was thick with fear, so palpable it almost choked you. Dawn had to be near when a strange sound shattered the stillness. At first, it was a faint scratching like claws dragging against wood. Everyone froze, ears straining. The sound grew louder. Something or someone was at the church doors. A chill settled deep in my gut. People exchanged uneasy glances. Some rose slowly from their beds, gripping their weapons tighter, while others pressed children closer, whispering desperate reassurances that rang hollow. The scratching turned to thuds. Something was ramming the doors, clawing at them, leaving deep grooves in the wood. The heavy bar securing the doors groaned under the strain. Panic spread like wildfire. People began shouting, clutching their weapons tighter, their voices tinged with both determination and hopelessness. A woman dropped to her knees, crying out a prayer for salvation. Her voice was drowned out by the escalating chaos. Outside, the creatures howled, a low, guttural chorus that seeped through the walls and shook us to our core. It sounded like there were dozens of them, maybe more. Each strike against the door was like a hammer blow to our nerves. And then it happened. The door gave way with a deafening crack, splintering as though it were paper rather than reinforced wood and iron. The creatures surged in. Their massive, hunched forms filled the church, their grotesque silhouettes illuminated by flickering candlelight. They moved with an unnatural speed, their glowing eyes piercing the dimness, their snarls echoing off the stone walls. The room descended into chaos. A man with a spear charged the nearest creature, but it swatted him aside effortlessly. He slammed into the wall with a sickening crunch, his body crumpling like a rag doll. Another man swung a wooden club, only for the beast to grab his head in one clawed hand and crush it with horrifying ease. Blood sprayed across the floor as his body collapsed. Screams filled the air. Women cried out, clutching their children, while others scrambled to hide behind beds or furniture. The creatures tore through them with savage precision, their claws rending flesh, their jaws snapping bones. The church was filled with the stench of blood and death, and the sound of desperation and agony drowned out everything else. In the midst of the carnage, I noticed movement in the far corner. It was the crazed woman, the one who had attacked me earlier. She wasn't fighting or running like the others. Her face was twisted in concentration, her eyes darting around as if searching for something. I watched as she slipped toward a small door at the back of the church, moving like a shadow. Something inside me urged me to follow her. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was desperation. Either way, I knew staying meant certain death. I began weaving my way through the chaos, keeping low and avoiding the creatures who were too busy with their slaughter to notice me. She slipped through the door and I followed, my heart pounding. Beyond the door was a small, dimly lit room. By the time I entered, she was already at the far wall, pushing a bed aside with surprising strength. Beneath it, she revealed a hidden trap door. Without hesitation, she opened it and began to descend. Just as she disappeared into the darkness, her eyes met mine. They widened in surprise, and she growled something unintelligible before vanishing completely. The trap door swung shut behind her. I hesitated, my mind racing. My body trembled with fear and exhaustion. For all I knew, whatever lay beneath that trapdoor could be worse than what was happening above. But something told me this was my only chance. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The church was lost. The creatures would find me if I stayed. With no other options, I moved toward the trapdoor, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I opened it, peering down into the inky blackness below. A damp, earthy smell rose up to meet me. Steeling myself, I climbed down into the darkness, closing the door above me as I descended. I slowly descended the creaky wooden staircase into the unknown. Once at the bottom, I found myself in a narrow corridor, dimly lit by faint rays of light filtering through the cracks in the floor above. The air was thick with the stench of dampness and decay, and the uneven walls appeared to be crudely carved out of stone. I reached into my pocket and felt for my flashlight, my trusty companion, which fortunately was always with me. Clicking the switch, I turned it on and aimed the beam forward. The corridor stretched out ahead, sloping gently downward. I walked carefully, listening to every sound. The damp walls reflected the muffled echo of my footsteps, and the ceiling was low, forcing me to stoop. My nerves were stretched to the limit, but I kept moving, knowing that going back upstairs meant certain death. After a few minutes, I emerged into a small cavern. Its walls were covered with strange drawings and inscriptions. I moved closer, illuminating them with my flashlight. The drawings looked ancient, as if they were created thousands of years ago, but there were others, more recent ones, made by people who, like me, had found themselves in this cursed place. One of the walls depicted a city that resembled the one I had arrived in. It was surrounded by a forest and appeared to be cut off from the rest of the world. Next to this image were scenes of battle. Native Americans armed with bows and spears fought against European settlers. Blood streaked the walls, and at the center of one scene was something resembling a ritual. A tribal shaman stood with his hands raised to the sky, and beneath him was an inscription in English. "Deceit brought death, and the deceivers are doomed. Their descendants shall suffer forever." I ran my hand over these words, trying to grasp their meaning. It seemed that the settlers had betrayed the native people, breaking their agreement or destroying their land. In response, the tribe had cursed them, trapping their descendants in this place with no hope of escape. Beside these ancient drawings were newer inscriptions, etched in desperation. Someone had scratched the letters below, as if trying to write blood, but never finished. Signs of madness were everywhere, drawings of monsters, crude maps, arrows pointing in different directions. I continued walking, my flashlight revealing new forks in the corridors. They branched out in all directions like a labyrinth designed to confuse anyone who dared to enter. With every step, I felt something moving nearby. My ears caught a rustle behind me, and I spun around sharply. At that moment, something darted past me. It was her, the crazed woman. She lunged out of the darkness, wielding a knife that looked ceremonial, and charged at me. I barely managed to dodge as the blade sliced through the air inches from my face. Her eyes burned with madness, and her voice was like the roar of a wild animal. She screamed that it was my fault, that I had brought death. Her accusations were incoherent, but each of her attacks was deadly. We grappled. I tried to knock the knife from her hands, but she was stronger than I expected. We both fell to the ground, and I felt the cold stone slam into my back. Her face was too close, far too close, and foam was frothing at her mouth. But then everything changed. A low growl came from the darkness. One of the creatures leapt out of the shadows. Its massive clawed paw struck the woman, knocking her off me. She screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor as the creature sank its teeth into her. Horrified, I scrambled backward, watching as her blood sprayed across the walls. Her screams faded as the creature tore into her neck. It was a ghastly sight. But I had no time to think. Realizing I was next, I bolted. The corridors blurred into a single chaotic swirl, but I couldn't afford to stop. My footsteps echoed through the tunnels, followed by the sound of heavy thuds and growls. The creature was chasing me. I felt the air behind me grow colder, knowing it was close. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The corridors grew narrower, and then, up ahead, I saw an underground river. Wide, black, and faintly illuminated by my flashlight. Without hesitation, I jumped into the water. The icy river swallowed me, and the current immediately swept me away, carrying me far from the dark corridors and the horrors that awaited me there. The icy, freezing water burned my skin as I plunged into the underground river. The current seized me instantly, spinning and dragging me with no chance to find solid footing. I tried to paddle with my hands, but the current was too strong, carrying me forward relentlessly. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, disappearing into the dark water and leaving me nearly blind. All I could do was fight to keep my head above the surface. The river twisted left, then right, as if trying to disorient me. At one point, I felt the current pulling me downward, a whirlpool. It spun me violently, and I struggled not to be dragged under. My feet briefly touched something solid, but the torrent yanked me away before I could gain any purchase. Gasping for air, I resurfaced and kept swimming, desperately clinging to each breath. Every bend in the river was unpredictable. Smooth cave walls blurred past me and the water slammed into rocks, creating a deafening echo. I clung to the faint hope that the creature I left behind wasn't pursuing me, but I didn't dare look back. Panic propelled me forward. The only thing keeping me going was the thought of escape. Suddenly, the river's speed increased. I realized the current was growing stronger and the roaring sound ahead grew louder. A waterfall. The realization struck me like a blow. I scrambled to grab the wall, a rock, anything, but the water was too powerful. It hurled me over the edge and I plummeted. The fall lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Wind howled past my ears, and the only thing I could see was the dark river waiting below. I hit the water with a force that felt like smashing into concrete. Pain shot through my body, but I broke the surface, gasping for air, and looked around. I had made it outside. The river continued to carry me, the current slightly less violent now. Exhaustion gripped me, but I couldn't afford to stop. Paddling weakly, I let the flow guide me downstream. After some time, the river began to slow. The current grew calmer, and I saw a shallow stretch ahead. My feet touched the bottom and I stumbled, barely able to stay upright. Finally, I dragged myself onto the riverbank. I collapsed onto the ground, drenched and utterly drained. Every muscle ached. My lungs burned for air, and my heart thundered in my chest as though it might burst. But I couldn't rest. My instincts screamed that I was still in danger. Forcing myself to my feet, I started walking along the riverbank. It was my only guide now. The night was dark, but I kept moving, driven by a single thought: get out. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the sky, I noticed the forest thinning. Mist rose from the river, and the air felt lighter. And then I saw it. A house. A small wooden ranger's cabin stood at the edge of the forest. It looked ordinary, even unremarkable, but to me, it was like a gift from the heavens. I took a few more steps and saw the door open. A man in a ranger's uniform stood on the porch, his face etched with surprise as he looked me over. I must have appeared as someone who had walked through hell itself, soaked, battered, filthy, and utterly exhausted. The fear that had gripped my heart for so long finally began to ease. I collapsed to the ground as my last reserves of strength left me. The man rushed toward me, his voice muffled, as if it came from underwater. A few more people emerged from the cabin, lifting me under my arms and helping me inside. I felt the warmth of their hands, their presence, as they carried me into safety. I was saved. Everything that had happened in the past hours felt like a dream, a horrifying, endless nightmare from which I had finally awakened. But I knew it was real. The town, the curse, the creatures, the crazed woman, it had all happened. No one would believe me. How could I explain what even I couldn't comprehend? But none of that mattered now. All I needed was rest. Lying on the floor in the warmth of the little cabin, I allowed myself to close my eyes, feeling safe for the first time all night.